Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jim Fay. I'm the Arctic Curator on board the U.S.S. Salem. On behalf of the Executive Director, Joanne Condon Walsh, the staff and volunteers, welcome to the U.S.S. Salem. I find it an honor and a privilege to be here addressing the families of the U.S.S. Eagle PE-56 casualties, her survivors, distinguished guests and visitors. I hope that in some way this long overdue Purple Heart ceremony will bring closure to an injustice that happened to the crew of the Eagle boat on April 23, 1945 off the coast of Maine. In closing this introduction, I would like to echo the following words of a salute to the Eagle boat crew. They're addressed on the plains of a Civil War campsite here in Massachusetts. I think they are appropriate. For all they were, for all they did, for all they did, all honor and glory yours now and forever. Now, Color Guard Sergeant, post the colors.
Detail. Halt. Left. Face. Order. Arms. Detail. Right shoulder. Arms. Detail. Present. Arms.
I would now like to have the trumpeter Vincent Macrina play the national anthem.
Details. Right shoulder. Arms. Present. Arms. Ready? Front. Order. Order. Ready?
I now invite Father Charles J. McCoy, U.S. Navy chaplain, to do the invocation.
Let us pray. Almighty and eternal God, source of truth and justice, we thank you for this day. We ask your blessing on all who serve aboard U.S.S. Eagle and all you who are gathered here to honor them. We believe that there's no greater gift that a person can give than that person lay down his life for another. May the award of the Purple Heart signify to the families of the victims a small consolation and gratitude of our nation after 57 years. For the 49 officers and crewmen of Eagle, we pray, eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May their souls and all the souls of the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. For the opening statement and historical background of the Eagle boat case, I call on Paul Lawton, who is a friend, patriot, and naval historian extraordinaire, who has never deviated from his quest to bring forth the truth in the sinking of the U.S.S. Eagle PE-56, a silent victim of the UA-53. Paul?
Thanks, Jim. I want to thank you all for coming. This is a tremendous event, and to see a tear in my eye, it's probably the first time in my life, because I'm not somebody that shows a lot of emotion. But this is something that I've worked on for a long time, and it wasn't just me. It was a collaborative effort with dozens of people, actually probably hundreds of people, a lot of whom are here today. Jim Fahey, one of my best friends who I've done a lot of military research with since he was the archivist at the Massachusetts Military Archives. I used to drive down in my high school days to his archives in Speen Street in Natick and spend days down there in his archives, and he was always helping people do research on tracking down their great-grandfather's military service in the Civil War and so forth. And Jim was always a hard worker. He would go through records, blowing the dust off of old books and so forth, and calling archives all over the place to help these people piece together their families' histories, their military histories. And Jim's been a great friend of mine over the years, and since he's come to the Salem here, we've done a lot of research on the Battle of the Atlantic, and he really was a tremendous assistance in this particular story. And another great guy who's here with us today is Bernard Cavalcanti, who's a senior archivist at the United States Naval Institute at the Washington Navy Yard in D.C. But I'm going to introduce them all to you. This is a historic event. This is probably, I believe, a precedent-setting event that the United States Navy has reversed naval history, changing the loss of a warship with significant loss of life in the very last days of World War II from non-enemy action to enemy action. At a little past noon, about 12:14 on Monday, April 23rd, 1945, the U.S. Navy subchaser, the U.S.S. PE-56, was on regular patrols towing targets off of South Portland. It was within 2 days of Germany's surrender, and these men had no idea of knowing that even though the end of the war in Europe was so close, Germany was operating a number of U-boats in and around the Gulf of Maine and off the American northeast coast, and at 14 minutes past the hour, a tremendous explosion was experienced aboard the ship, breaking it in two, sending it to the bottom within minutes with a loss of 49 men. There were 13 survivors. Luckily, we have 3 of them here with us today. Lieutenant John Scagnelli of New Jersey and his wife and several family members are with us. He was the only survivor from the bow section of the ship and the only surviving officer. And with him we have John Breeze of Washington State and Harold Peterson of upstate New York. All 3 of these men were just recently relieved of their shift 15 minutes before the detonation that lifted the ship out of the water and broke it in two immediately. These men always knew in their heart, and John Breeze testified at the Court of Inquiry subsequent to the events that he saw a submarine broach the surface, as did 7 other survivors that day. That testimony was completely set aside by the convening authority, and they came to a completely inconsistent finding of a boiler explosion. And it took us 57 years, many people working on this, to overturn naval history. It's now the official record in the United States, German archives and so forth, that the German U-boat, the U-853, under command of a young 24-year-old Lieutenant Commander, Oberleutnant zur See Helmut Framsdorf, torpedoed their ship that day. Framsdorf's submarine was hunted for the next 12 days by a comprehensive anti-submarine operation that was put into action by the Navy and Coast Guard. It involved 31 U.S. Navy warships, dozens of Coast Guard warships, and American aircraft. They attacked that submarine the day of the sinking of the Eagle-56. They attacked it the next afternoon, the 24th of April, off of Monhegan Island. They attacked it the next day on the 25th off the mouth of Penobscot Bay. They lost track of her until it was sighted, surfaced off of Wellfleet on Cape Cod, Massachusetts on the 29th, but it evaded detection. It wasn't until the early evening of the 5th of May that it torpedoed the U.S.-flagged coal collier, the Black Point, 3.7 miles southeast of Point Judith, Rhode Island, sending her to the bottom with a loss of 11 crewmen and 1 U.S. Navy armed guard. Within hours, that ship came under attack by hunter-killer task group of the U.S. Navy and underwent 16 hours of successive hedgehog and depth charge attacks. Over 20 attacks were conducted, dropping 15 tons of ordnance until literally Commander Framsdorf's cap and chart table was brought to the surface. This was the last major chapter in the Battle of the Atlantic. It was the last German U-boat sunk, the last American warship sunk in American coastal waters, and the last American-flagged freighter sunk during the war. And it took 57 years for these men to receive the appropriate recognition. And we're glad to have the 3 survivors with us today and the families of about 13 families of men who were killed that day, who are here to receive on the behalf of their fathers, sons, and husbands the Purple Heart, setting the record straight and giving them the appropriate recognition of their loss in the line of duty as a result of enemy action. Just like to introduce some of our VIPs, the men and women sitting up front here. To my right is U.S. Navy Chaplain Father Charles J. McCoy. I'm sorry. First is Tom Kelly, who's the Commissioner of Massachusetts Veteran Services. He is also a Purple Heart recipient and a recipient of the Medal of Honor, which many people know as the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Yes, Tom.
Sorry, I mixed up your order here, Father. Then we have Father Charles J. McCoy. We have the guy who is leading the battle against our latest enemy here in Massachusetts, a great friend of mine and a tremendous individual, formerly in the House of Representatives in Massachusetts and then a district attorney in Plymouth County. Was recently appointed by President George W. Bush as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, Michael Sullivan. Congressman Stephen Lynch is on his way. He was on the... Oh, he is. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that, Congressman.
That was fast.
Sorry about that. See, he's sitting in Jim Fahey's seat. That's why I didn't see him back here. But if you could take the appropriate seat over here, Congressman, that would be great. Jim's got to sit down sooner or later. You know, retired Coast Guard from World War II active service. His legs are going to get tired after a while, though I've never seen him get tired in all the years of doing research here. But Congressman Steve Lynch. Congressman Lynch just won the seat that was recently held by the great guy, Congressman Joe Moakley, who was really the guy who opened the doors for us with the Secretary of the Navy 2 years ago. And my father, who was very friendly with Congressman Moakley, made a call one day, and Congressman Moakley invited us up to his office with the Westland brothers, and we told him our story. And he was the one that really started this thing going. And Congressman Joe Moakley just passed away last year on Memorial Day. He was a tremendous man, and Steve Lynch is a great guy to fill his position. Next we have the District Attorney from Plymouth County, great friend of mine, Timothy Cruz. We had Representative William Tobin coming, but I don't see him here. I see that we have our mayor here, Mayor William Phelan, the mayor of Quincy. And I believe down at the end is a representative from the American Legion, Mr. John Spider Smith. For other elected officials or past elected officials, we also have with us today former mayor and now clerk of court, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Tobin. On my left here is again my good friend, retired U.S. Coast Guard man and a great individual, the archivist and curator here at the U.S.S. Salem, Jim Fahey. Next to him is another great friend of mine who I never met personally until today. I've been calling this guy and driving him crazy. Every time he picks up the phone, I'm sure he says, oh no, it's that Lawton guy again from Massachusetts. But he always says, hey Paul, and you called me Cal. And he accessed for us a lot of records which were only recently declassified by the NSA, including some incredible records from the submarine tracking room called Op 20G in Washington, D.C., which I had no idea the detailed information that they had. They actually identified the submarine as the U-853, and they knew the commander's name as Framsdorf. And Cal was absolutely instrumental in getting the Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England, to correct naval history on June 23rd of last year. He worked tirelessly reconstructing detailed history of the 853 and the sinking of the Eagle 56. And with all that information, he presented it to the Director of Naval History, Dr. William Dudley, and he made recommendation to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Vernon Clark, and then it went up to then Secretary of the Navy, Richard Danzig, and who was recently replaced by Secretary Gordon England by President George W. Bush. And Secretary England had the courage, he's a tremendous guy, and he's a hero to all of us, that he signed that recommendation on the 23rd of last year, setting the record straight once and for all. Sitting next to Cal is, my biggest hero, and the guy that got me involved in military history. My father, retired judge of the Plymouth County Probate Family Court, Jim Lawton. My father's a Purple Heart recipient and a Bronze Star recipient. He was injured in the outskirts of Munster, Germany after the first combat jump across the line, the Rhine, Operation Varsity, and he was wounded on March 30th of 1945. We grew up in a family that really respected the military. My mother's oldest brother, John Henry Cashman, who was a lieutenant in the 1st Armored Division, was killed at the Battle of Hill 609, Tunisia, North Africa, on April 30th, 1945. So we know the meaning of a Purple Heart to families that have lost members or have been wounded in action. And it's a great thing of respect and honor for the family to have for the loss that family has experienced. But my father was instrumental through this entire thing. When we first talked to the Westlands, I told my father about it. We always collaborate in military research, and he said, you have to straighten this thing out. He said, it's a terrible thing that the Navy did, and there's really something that happened here. You got to straighten this thing out. I know you can do it. And he pushed throughout this entire operation. He made this event today possible and was instrumental throughout this entire operation, meeting with our friends, coming to meetings here at the Salem, and meeting with Harold Peterson and John Breeze and so forth. So I want to give a special note to my father, Jim Lawton. Next, we have a good friend of mine, Chris Hugo, who's a technical wreck diver and a naval historian in his own right. He's the guy you may be reading about. He's been working with the Mass Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, following these guys around some pond out in the western part of Massachusetts looking for Babe Ruth's piano. He's dragging my infrared camera around the bottom there. Chris, I need that thing back this year. I got a couple of operations I'm looking for. But Chris is a great guy, and he helped us a great deal in this particular project. In our search 2 years ago for the wreck of the Eagle 56 off the coast of Portland, Maine, he helped to organize that operation. We're going back out next year, and we're ultimately going to find her and have our deep dive team with Bob Yeagle and Dave Daly, who are also here today, who are going to go down and do an inspection of the wreck once we find her. We next have Captain Bill Glass. Bill is a member of the U.S.S. Salem Officers Association, I believe, and great guy, and he's been instrumental in the operations here at the U.S.S. Salem and the raising money for the upkeep of this museum, and I'd like to give him a round of applause as well. Then have, I think next to him is Commander Gillette, Robert Gillette, Commander also of the U.S. Navy, also a great guy who's been very involved in naval matters and the recruitment of people for Annapolis and so forth. And we're very honored to have him here today. Next, I believe, is, Commander George Whitbread of the U.S. Navy has come to visit today and pay his respects to the men who were lost in the Eagle 56 as well. Thanks for coming, Commander. Next to him is Commander Liam Slane. He is with the United States Coast Guard, and he works with the Marine Safety Division. Liam is a great guy. He's married to a girl who graduated with me from New England School of Law, and we met down when we were sworn into the U.S. Supreme Court 2 years ago. I talked with Liam extensively, and he contacted me and gave me the names of a number of our forensic engineers and naval architects who were instrumental in piecing together the physical implausibility of a boiler explosion causing the sinking of this ship. And he got us in line with the foremost authorities in this particular area that came to the conclusion that there's no way that boiler blew that ship 3 feet out of the water and threw 300 feet of water in the air unless they were stoking that furnace with TNT. And that was also instrumental in getting the correction of naval history. And Liam, I sent him an invitation down to Washington about 2 months ago. It turns out that he had been transferred down to Philadelphia, and it took the Navy 2 months to find him. So it's, next we have Colonel of the United States Marine Corps, Edward Murphy, who is here with the Color Guard, the 2nd Marine Corps Division Association Color Guard. And thank you for coming, Colonel. And I believe we had, I'm not sure if he's here, but we had coming Michael DiPaolo, who I believe was representing the VFW. I'm not sure if he's here, though. Oh, he's back there. Sorry about that, sir. We had a seat for you with a name on it and everything. I think he's also the head of the Massachusetts VA hospitals as well. I'd like to recognize several other groups that are here today for assisting us. As you saw, we have a tremendous trumpeter. He's the head of the band at Brockton High School, a great friend of ours, and I can't thank him enough for coming here, Mr. Vincent Macrina. We have, as I said, the Color Guard from the 2nd Marine Corps Division Association, with a number of friends of mine there, including Fred Flamini from the fire department, a good buddy of mine, and he worked with the Westland brothers, Bob and Paul, also from the Brockton Fire Department, so it's like a little family here. We get a lot of firemen from the Brockton area today. We have the Massachusetts Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company Color Guard as well. These men, I got to thank you for coming down today and showing your presence for these men who were killed on the Eagle 56. It's a great organization. As you saw the young men and women in their Naval Cadet dress, we have the group of the Navy Sea Cadets, and they're here under the direction of Dick Paulus, who's a great guy who assisted us in getting this entire ceremony set up today and escorting people to their seats and so forth, so you can give them a hand as well. I'll just quickly read through. I don't want to take up too much time because we got to get to the presentations, but we have members of the United States Navy League. We have members of the U.S.S. Salem Sailors Association, and we also have here a group of new ensigns from MIT and Boston University with us today to share the ceremony with us. We also have Virginia Hurley, who is the president of the Gold Star Wives of America Association. And with her is Brian Stanley, who designed their flag. He is a recipient of 3 Purple Hearts from the Vietnam War as well. Thanks for coming, sir. I look through the crowd, there are so many people that I'd like to give special recognition and thanks for, but time is not going to permit me to do that because there are dozens of you out here who have been instrumental, and the people that I've talked to who've accessed personal service information and records of their loved ones who were killed. I just want to thank you all. I'm sorry if I can't mention every single one of you because I know I'm going to miss dozens of you, but I want you to know that everyone here is extremely thankful for the support that you've given to these men in the Eagle 56. As I said, this is going to be something that you'll remember because this is history making, and I don't think this is ever going to happen again in U.S. naval history. The correction of naval history regarding the sinking of a warship and the posthumous recognition of Purple Hearts to all these men. We have 49 men who are eligible for Purple Hearts who were killed outright, and out of the 13 survivors, it turns out that after the Navy reviewed the medical records, much to my dismay, they determined that only 2 of the survivors, and 2 of them are here with us today, John Scagnelli and Harold Peterson, sustained rather serious wounds, but the other 11 men who were involved in this sinking, including John Breeze, who's with us today, had a terrible case of hypothermia, came extremely close to dying out there. They were kept in a naval dispensary at Grand Trunk in South Portland for over a week after the sinking. But according to the Navy's criteria, that was not serious enough to warrant the issuance of Purple Hearts. I don't believe that that is correct and appropriate, but I'm not the Navy. But particularly here with John Breeze today, he deserves every award and medal and commendation and round of applause that we can give him for being here today with us. Now I would ask that Mr. Tom Kelly would stand up, and he is going to actually conduct a presentation of the Purple Hearts. First, we're going to have the presentation of the Purple Hearts to the survivors, but I'd like to have all 3 of the survivors come up here if I could. Lieutenant John Scagnelli, Harold Peterson, and John Breeze. If you could all come up to the podium and face the crowd and get a round of applause.
Want me to get on that side? Want me to get on that side? So that
Sure. Well, you guys can stay on this. Actually, why don't you get on this side over here? You stand over here. If we have more of the camera crews over here. Now, this is the tough part of the story. These 3 men were all relieved of their shifts 15 minutes before the detonation on board the Eagle 56. John Scagnelli was the engineering officer, lieutenant. He was personally responsible for the machinery and the equipment on that vessel. And working under him were these 2 fine men, Harold Peterson and John Breeze. If you look at the photo when you came on board, the one on the bottom, it has the photo of them, the engineering crew, about 18 men, that was taken down to Key West. And remarkably in that photo, you'll see all 3 of these men. That was around May, much warmer and much happier duty down at Key West, obviously. They were working the sound training school down there. And I'm sure they still have happy hour down at Key West in those days, right? But, you know, these guys had all had a certain cloud of suspicion that followed them, and I've talked with all of them. Men and women who died, the men who died, their families received letters back to the effect that a boiler explosion caused their death. These men were all responsible for working in the boiler room. I believe Mr. Breeze was working in the engine room prior to this. Peterson was in the boiler room. So they were all just relieved of shift. They all checked to make sure the water levels and pressures and so forth were perfectly up to spec. The ship was also standing by at a dead stop and wasn't making near maximum steam. But to have this follow them, and then John Scagnelli was burdened with the duty of having to send back letters to all of the families of the men who were killed, basically stating that an accident resulted in their death. And he's always had this certain cloud that he felt that some of the families may have felt that he may have been personally responsible. And I know that he's happy to have it finally cleared, your name cleared and all of your names cleared, that there was nothing that you could have done. These guys were sitting below decks having a wonderful meal of Franks and beans that day at the time the ship exploded. And so it's a great honor to have you men here today. And first would like to present the Purple Heart to Lieutenant Scagnelli. Now to Harold Peterson.
Thank you.
And I want John Breeze to come up here and be recognized by the crowd as well. Mr. Breeze. Took the Navy 57 years to come up with the Purple Hearts for these men, and I hope it doesn't take 57 more to get you a Purple Heart. We're hoping you're still around if it takes that long.
I haven't got that many left, Bob.
We dismissed?
You may stand down, sir.
I do. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now for the issuance of the Purple Hearts to the men who were killed and the family members who are with us today. I'm going to start first with the officers. Then we have the family of one non-commissioned officer, and then the families of 10 enlisted men. The first officer that we had expected to issue the Purple Heart to was a wonderful lady who I've been in contact with, lived down in Annapolis, Maryland. Her name was Virginia Pettibone. She was the widow of the executive officer, Lieutenant John R. Loback. About a month ago, she received the Purple Heart in the mail. It turned out, however, that she passed away just about 2 weeks ago. She had a massive heart attack, but before her passing, she requested that the Purple Heart be delivered to her in the hospital, which it was. And I had been in contact with her, even though she was in ill health. She expected to come down here. She was unable to make it. So this will not be an issuance of a Purple Heart because the Purple Heart is still in her estate, which is still being processed. But her nephew, the nephew of Lieutenant John Loback, who is also named after him, is here today. And I'd like Mr. Loback to wave your hand, sir, and we thank you for coming and representing your family here today, and we're very sorry that your aunt was unable to make it. She was a great lady, and I had had a number of correspondences and conversations with her. We're very sorry for your loss. The next issuance for the only other officer whose family is here is a guy who contacted me by phone just about a month and a half ago, Mr. George Vanderheiden from Andover, Massachusetts. His father, Lieutenant Ambrose George Vanderheiden, was on the bridge that day and was killed in the bow section of the ship. And when he contacted me to tell me that he was the son of Lieutenant Vanderheiden, it turned out that he never met his father. His mother was 7 months pregnant with him at the time of the loss. So I'd like to have Mr. Vanderheiden come up. Now we have a presentation to be made to the one enlisted man whose family we've been able to locate. And that was Ensign Roy F. Swan. And his brother Frank Swan and his family is here today. If we could have Frank come up to receive the Purple Heart on behalf of his brother.
Excuse me, my sister is also here. Her name is Colleen Sethry. She came in from California yesterday. Colleen. And I think that this is a time that those of us here owe so much to this man behind me. I may bawl, but the man of this ship would have always been nameless and faceless without Paul Lawton. And my brother will always be 24, but we would not have known this country what really happened if it weren't for Paul Lawton. And all of us here want to thank you, and I will do it personally. Thank you so much, Ray, for coming, but thanks, Paul Lawton.
Thank you very much, but as I said before, it was a collaborative effort, not just myself. I may have been the thorn in a lot of people's sides to get a lot of stuff going, but I mobilized a lot of people, and I had the help of all these guys up here. So it was really, all of the people here really deserve a lot of credit for all the help that they've gotten for this effort. Now we're going into the 10 enlisted men, only 9 of whom are represented here by family. We have one surviving brother of one of the men who was killed who was unable to make it, but he's represented today by some family friends who are here on his behalf. But for the first of the enlisted men, going through alphabetical order, John Joseph Alexander, a fireman, first class, his brother and family is here, James E. Alexander, to receive the Purple Heart in his behalf.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Can I say something? Sure. I'd like to mention, too, that my sister is also here. And 2 other things. We were very fortunate in that my mother, when my other brother and I were in Europe in the Army, my mother's fortunate enough to have one of the 13 survivors come to our house and tell my mother the true story of what happened. And we've always felt very bad for the families that went all these years not knowing the true story of what these men went through. And Paul deserves a lot of credit. But Harold Peterson, picture was all over the United States of America in the New York Times, and that's how I found out. I finally traced Harold, and that's how I found out about the program and got in with Paul. And I'm very grateful to him, I really am.
The next man who was killed on the Eagle 56 to receive a posthumous Purple Heart is Robert Gurnett Coleman. He was the ship's cook, 3rd class, and I believe he is represented here today by his daughter, Beth Shearer, and I believe his widow, Frances Coleman Miller, was unable to attend because of health problems. But I believe he is also represented here today by his sister, Mrs. Carol Cleaver, and if we could have you come up to receive the Purple Heart.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, it's my grandmother, Mrs. Frances Miller, and she's 99, just about, and couldn't make it because of her health. But I'd like to recognize my aunt, his sister, who's here, Carol Cleaver. And I want to thank Paul, too. It's just miraculous what he's done. Thank God for Paul and thank God for Harold. If I hadn't read the paper and had my cousin call me and say, "Did you see the paper?" I wouldn't have this peace, this connection of the father that I never knew either. So I think I'm the youngest baby of all those men, but it's great to meet all the other people, and thank you.
We have the family of Harold Samuel Glenn, who was a machinist mate first class. His widow, Esther Lee Glenn Smith, who lives, I believe, out in California, was unable to make it. However, her son, Mr. William P. Rollin, and his wife, I believe, are supposed to be here today. I'm not sure if they are here, but if they are, oh, here they are. Come up, sir.
Thank you very much. So I have to put it back in the box.
Apparently, this was not opened yet.
No, it was. I just put it back. Wait. I think open on that end. Thank you. Although I didn't know Harold, I knew all of his family, and I grew up with his mother, you know, calling her Grandma Glenn, and I'd met his brother and two sisters since he'd lost, previously, had lost his older brother in, over Europe during the war. And my mother, again, saw Harold Peterson's picture in the paper, and I was reading it, and because she had been telling me the story about the submarine since I was old enough to know. And I called her up and I said, is that the ship that Glenn was on? And she goes, "I think so. How can I get a hold of Harold Peterson?" So it all went from there, just like everybody else has said. Thank you. Thanks again, Paul.
The next enlisted man we had who had received the Purple Heart posthumously was coxswain Arthur Albert Grosh. And he was to be represented by his brother, Albert Grosh, but he was unable to make it. He lives in Missouri, and because of health reasons, he wasn't able to make it today. But he has several friends of Arthur Albert. One of his best friends was a guy by the name of Mr. Charles Elstemeyer, who is here today with his daughter and son-in-law, David and Nancy Pevler from Rhode Island. Both of them are active duty in the U.S. Navy. Because Albert Grosh has received the Purple Heart in his brother's behalf and he's not here today, this will not be an issuance of the Purple Heart on his behalf, but I'd like to give you a little historical background, which is kind of remarkable in this story. It turned out that Arthur Grosh had a number of other brothers, including Albert, but he had a brother named Raymond who joined the U.S. Coast Guard and died in a tragic boating accident. This is in the also during World War II. He had another brother named Richard who was a Marine who died in action on the island of Tinian in the Pacific. And that occurred before the loss of Arthur Albert Grosh himself and the sinking of the U.S.S. PE-56. It turns out that his brother Albert, who I believe was in the Army, was on a transport headed to the Pacific Theater when he received orders to return home because his mother lost 3 other brothers. So if we could have Mr. Elstemeyer and Mr. and Mrs. Pevler stand in recognition They should be here today. I don't see them here, but if we could, oh, there they are. We have one more really incredible story here. Young man who was killed on board the Eagle 56 that day was a pharmacist mate first class by the name of James Paul Johnson. And he came from a real big family down in Alabama, because we got 6 brothers and sisters here today that all came up from Alabama. And when I talked to them, it was remarkable, because it turns out that he was not assigned aboard a ship. And in fact, I don't think he had ever served aboard a ship. He was acting as a pharmacist mate at the Grand Trunk Naval Dispensary, and apparently filled in for somebody that day, an absentee, on the boat. So it was the first time he'd ever stepped foot on board this boat at 5 minutes past 8 in the morning of Monday, the 23rd of April. Crew that he never knew, probably was walking around introducing himself, and 4 hours, 10 minutes later, his ship exploded and he was killed. But his family is here today, and he's got a number of brothers and sisters, Mr. and Mrs. Billy Ray Johnson, Mr. and Mrs. H.M. Johnson, Edward and Gloria Johnson Yates, his sister Gloria. Mrs. Azola Parker, I believe, is the oldest of the children. I think she's 87, and she'll be receiving the Purple Heart on her brother's behalf. We also have Mr. and Mrs. Sidney Johnson, and Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd and Mary Ruth Johnson, and Mr. and Mrs. Herbert S. Johnson. So we have a big Johnson clan who's traveled a long way up from Alabama, and I'm glad that we have nice warm weather for you here so you don't feel out of place. But if we could have the Johnson brothers and sisters come up to receive the Purple Heart, which will be presented to Azola.
I am honored to stand here and receive this Purple Heart from my brother. I'm the oldest of this crowd. Our parents were living when this was happening, and it was a very hard time on them. One of my brothers served on D-Day, and he's got an honor there from that, this one here. So I thank you for it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Congratulations. The next presentation will be on behalf of Frederick J. Michelson, a machinist mate first class, and here to accept the award in his behalf is his son, who is named after him, Frederick John Michelson Jr. And I've had the honor of talking with him a number of times over the phone, and it's a great honor to meet him today. He works for the National Park Service, I believe, as a ranger. And I think this may be considered park territory, so don't anyone litter or anything. But it's a great honor to have you up here, sir. I really appreciate you coming.
It's really a privilege to be here and accept this. Second, for my mother, the Navy waited just a little long for her to accept it herself, unfortunately. So she's unable to be here. She's in a home right now. My father, Mike Michelson, relieved Harold Peterson at 12 o'clock, 14 minutes before the explosion, torpedo. And Harold's from Rochester, and my wife, Dawn, of 17 years today, is from Rochester. So it's a small world. And my sister just flew in from Sitka, Alaska this morning to be here, and thank you very much.
The next man to receive his Purple Heart posthumously, I was in contact with his family very early on in this case. It escapes me now how I even got in touch with the Mitchells from New Jersey, but Mrs. Mitchell, her brother Harold Ralph Rodman was a yeoman first class, and he had survived the invasions of Italy and I believe North Africa, Italy, and Europe. And when he was being transferred back here to the States, he told his sister that, what easier duty and what safer duty could there be than, operating and patrolling out of Portland, Maine. Well, he had no idea that that was as hot a war zone as the European theater, and he was one of the men who was unfortunate to be killed in the sinking of the Eagle 56. But to receive the Purple Heart in his behalf is his sister and brother-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Vincent Mitchell of New Jersey.
I can never thank Paul for all he's done. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
The next presentation is on behalf of Nathan Cheney Stafford, who was a fireman first class. And I believe today he is represented here by his daughter, Charlotte Lacey, and I'm not sure if his widow was able to make it. No, but his widow, Leola Lawrence Stafford, apparently was unable to make it today, but thank you very much for coming.
My daughter found out about it in Virginia Beach. She read it in the paper, and Mr. Peterson, whom I've talked to on the phone, and Mr. Scagnelli I've talked on the phone, and Mr. Breeze I've talked on the phone. So we've had quite the conversations, and my family's here. I have a sister, a brother, 2 daughters, nieces and nephews, and all great-grandchildren and grandchildren of my dad. Thank you very much.
The next presentation is on behalf of Raymond Robert Wallace, who was a seaman second class, and he has 3 elderly sisters, all of whom live in California, and because of health reasons were unable to make it. But he has his niece here to receive his Purple Heart today on his behalf, Miss Sandra Lubera, I believe from Rhode Island.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. My Uncle Raymond, and on behalf of my aunts in California, I accept this, and I thank Paul and all his associates for everything they have done. We really appreciate it.
And we have the final presentation for the last enlisted man who was killed, and this is by no means the least. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't for the Westerlin family, we wouldn't be here today. Bob and Paul Westerlin are good friends of mine. They're Brockton firemen, and We grew up together in Brockton, and I looked up to them as kind of older brothers. I can remember being up in New Hampshire and them taking me mountain climbing and stuff like that. They were always real fun guys, always boating and doing a lot of fun stuff. So they were great guys to hang around with, and I guess they couldn't shake the little kid even when I was in my 20s and 30s, because one night we're actually sitting around having a couple beers, as a lot of these stories turn out, and they mentioned to me that their father was killed in this warship off the coast of Maine. And at that point, I had spent probably 15 years at that point studying the Battle of the Atlantic, and particularly German U-boat operations off the American Northeast coast. And Bob mentioned to me that he always wanted to dive on the U-853 off of Block Island because they always had a suspicion that that was the submarine that sank his father's ship. Well, I had never heard of such a thing. We had heard that an Eagle boat was lost off of Portland, but it was as a result of some unknown explosion. But there was no indication of enemy action, so I went home that night and looked up one of my source books from the German archives, which it turns out Bernard Cavalcanti from the Naval Historical Center collaborated with Dr. Professor Jürgen Rohr in Germany for over 10 years in the post-war battle assessments. And they put together all the Allied and Axis battle reports, and they had come to the conclusion in the 1970s, though they never really got that deep into this particular incident, but it was always their opinion that most likely the Eagle 56 was sunk by the 853 because she was known to be operating in those waters at the time. So that's really where it started 4.5 years ago. I think it was March 4.5 years ago, just over this little conversation we had, and that's what started this real obsession that we all started working on, and we've been collaborating throughout this entire thing. We were up 2 years ago with Chris Hugo and the entire team. We had an extensive side scan sonar survey off of Cape Elizabeth, Maine, looking for the Eagle, and we're going to go back up either this year or next year to ultimately locate the wreck. But it was all because of the Westerlands, and if they had never put that bug into my ear, we wouldn't be here today, and these guys probably never would have received this recognition, and the naval history would have remained as it is and as it had been. So, you know, this is a great honor to be here with the Westerland family, and their father, Ivar A. Westerland, was a seaman second class on board the Eagle 56. When he was killed, he left his widow, Phyllis, and 4 young children, Paul, Bob, Fred, and Carol. And they received this letter from the Navy basically stating that we're very sorry your father died as a result of an accident. Then they received a very nice letter from Lieutenant Scagnelli, which stated that I'm very sorry for your loss, that it was an explosion. He didn't mention a boiler, by the way. He got away with that. He wasn't going to fall for that one. But they didn't let him put in a submarine or torpedo. But it's always really bothered them, and they're all here today. Their families here in Fore. There got to be 20 of them, the entire Westerland clan. And as I said, they have a contingent of Brockton firemen here as well today. We're hoping to have a bagpiper, but we'll probably never get out of this place and back to have a couple of hors d'oeuvres or whatever at the DAV post. But I want to have Mrs. Kendrick, Phyllis Kendrick, the widow of Ivar Westerland, and Bob, Paul, Fred, and Carol all come up to receive the Purple Heart on their father's behalf. Mr. Kelly directed me to present this medal myself, and I am not going to argue with a Medal of Honor winner. So, thank you very much, sir. Let's both present it. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
Go easy, be careful.
That concludes the presentation of awards, but I'd like to recognize 2 other families of men who are survivors who are here today. As I mentioned, there were 13 survivors initially from the sinking. We have 3 of them here today, Mr. Lieutenant Scagnelli and John Breeze and Harold Peterson, but there are two other families representing survivors who have since passed away. One of them was Oscar F. Davis, machinist mate 3rd class. He is here represented here today by Mrs. Lorraine Davis Tracy, I believe his widow, Mr. Robert and Mrs. Sharon Davis Atkins, daughter and son-in-law, Mr. Gerald and Mrs. Denise Davis, his son and daughter-in-law, and Oscar Davis, who had, I believe, passed away, I believe, in 1986. I'm not exactly sure on that. There are so many dates and so forth, and I forgot to jot that particular date down here, but I'd like the Davis family to please stand and receive. Here they are over here. The Atkins. Okay, apparently her mother was unable to make it, but oh, I'm sorry. But thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. Okay, right. And we have one other family, I believe, is here, the family of Lawrence Edwards. And I believe Mr. Joel and Mrs. Debbie Edwards were to be here, and Mr. Ted Edwards, his son, and Miss Jean Edwards, his daughter, I believe, had intended to. Here they are right here. Great, and the grandson, the whole family here from the Edwards. Great. Thank you for coming. Oh, Granny Edwards is here? Oh, wow. Thank you for coming. We had one other widow who is going to be here, Mrs. Luttrell, wife of the widow of John Luttrell, who passed away in 1996. He lived up in Portland, Maine, and he asked his widow upon his death to be cremated and to have his remains scattered over the area of the sinking of his ship, which she complied with, and I believe that was in 1996, and I know several of these men have had the opportunity in the last several years of his life to meet with him. He's a great guy, and he passed away just about a year before I really got involved in this and was able to locate his widow, but she was unable to make it today. But that concludes the issuance of the Purple Hearts. Now I would just ask that Lieutenant Scagnelli and John Breeze and Harold Peterson come up to the ship's bell, and we're going to have Lieutenant Scagnelli, is the surviving officer, is going to read off the roll of the men who were killed. First the officers, then the non-commissioned officers, then the enlisted men, and we're going to have an individual toll of the bell with each of the names called.
Detail. Right shoulder. Pull.
Okay, I have a list. Yeah. It is my sad duty as the senior surviving officer of the U.S.S. Eagle, and with deep sympathies to all the families that are here and who are not here but are here in spirit, to read the list of those who were killed on the U.S.S. Eagle. Commander of the Eagle, Lieutenant James G. Early. Lieutenant John R. Lawback. Lieutenant Ambrose G. Vanderheiden. Ensign Seth H. Chapin. Ensign Roy F. Swan. John Joseph Alexander. James Orville Brown. Robert Gurnett
Coleman, Percy Collins, James Oliver Cunningham, Robert Lee Davies, Joseph Patrick Geegan, Harold Samuel Glenn, Walter Wren Go, John Rodriguez Gonzalez, Arthur Albert Grosh, William Lloyd Harden, James Paul Johnson, Norris Wilbur Jones, Robert Valjean Kessler, Paul Jaron Knapp, Joseph Andrew Wyden, Maurice Joseph Manning, Edward Frederick Mathis, Joseph Howard Mackenzie, John Charles Merck, Frederick Michelson, William B. Morgan, George William Nugent, Zug Chesley Phelps, Christopher Columbus Phillips, Jasper Davis Pulley, Virgil Quinn Jr., Harold Ralph Rodman, Archibald Ronald, George Sabatino, Edward Joseph Schneider, Joseph Frederick Seltzer, Elliot Massey Shin, James Hutchins Smith, Nathan Cheney Stafford, Leonard Joseph Sorwich, James Francis Talley, Raymond Robert Wallace, Henry Lewis, Ira Adolph Westerlin, Ellis Elmer Whitcomb, Ralph William Woods, Earl E. Young, and those who survived but are now deceased: Oscar Davis, Lawrence Edwards, Cletus Freen, John Happold, Daniel Jarnick, Edward G. Lockhart, John Luttrell, Joseph Priestas, William A. Thompson, and John A. Winiski.
I'd like to have the color guard for the laying of the wreath.
Oh, yeah. She's heavy. Oh. Oh.
we might all be able to sit now. We're going to have a presentation of a plaque by Harold Peterson.
First of all, John Scaglione, Johnny Breeze, and myself, we want to stand here and represent the crew of PE-56. We also want to thank the U.S. United States Navy and the United States government for being big enough and honest enough to retract their statement from a mysterious explosion, possibly a boiler, to that of what it actually truthfully was, a torpedo by enemy action. I wonder if everybody realizes what Paul has done and what he's gone through. I think you do, but I'd like to just say a little more. Just think of the number of hours, days, weeks, months, years, 3.5, 4 years, working at this diligently, his whole heart into it, obstruction after obstruction, never turning back. You know, he reminds me of a real national football player. You start at one end of the goal line, look ahead, and boy, I got to get there. And he just did. He sidestepped, jumped over any obstacle that came up. And we certainly take our hats off to him. He's been a wonderful person to all of us. We want to present a plaque of thankfulness and gratitude to Paul Lawton and his dad, James, retired judge, two mighty fine people. Now, John Scaglione and Johnny Briggs and I, we crisscrossed phone conversations across the country and came up with the idea we'd like to make a plaque.
Mr. Harold Peterson came up with the idea.
We're all equal. We're all equal. And we come up with the colors of black and gold. Now, the plaque is, the background is black, and the gold is, the letters etched onto this black background in gold. There's quite a meaning to these colors, black and gold. The black is for that big, almighty, dark sea. The gold is for the goodness and the brightness all this has brought to you and me. And it seemed to fit in there quite well. You know, what Paul has done, he's brought the PE-56 crew and families together. He brought the crew to the surface again. Everybody's reading about them, seeing their pictures, talking about them. It's really a wonderful, wonderful thing. So, you know, as we, and this is the way the plaque is, and this is what it reads. At the top is a picture of the U.S.S. Eagle PE-56 being hit by torpedo, split in half, raised out of the water, and the water spout going in the air. And it reads as follows. In appreciation and gratitude from the PE-56 crew and families, and we do mean families because they're a very, very, very big part of this, to Paul M. Lawton, Esquire, and his father, Judge Retired James R. Lawton, for the effort and dedication put forth to bring to the surface the forgotten disaster of the PE-56 Eagle boat and crew after 56 years from a mysterious explosion to the true facts, torpedoed and sunk in action. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Now, the three survivors, John Scaglione, Johnny Breeze, and myself, these are our individual signatures. And, you know, they're never going to be forgotten. I mean, I'm sure they'll go into the National Museum in Washington, the Naval Archives, maybe even in the history books so that the future young generations can read about it. And when Paul hangs this in his office, every time he looks at it, they'll be remembered and brought alive. And Jan, the three of us, get your hands up. We thank you to you.
We appreciate you, Paul.
Thanks again. I'm going to ask Jim Fahey to come forward and present the color guards for the firing of a 21-gun salute.
Carry out the 21-gun salute.
Order! Who?
Will Father McCord please come forward for the benediction?
Let us pray. Almighty God, we salute those who have died in Eagle as a result of torpedoing, and also for the survivors who have since died. May they rest in peace. Amen.
Would you please retire the colors?